Hi, Guy, into sleepy, boring history. The plague arrived in Europe in October of 1347, carried on ships that docked at Messina, with crews already dying, with rats in their holds whose fleas bore bacteria that would reshape the continent more profoundly than any war, any conquest, any deliberate human action ever had. Within 5 years, between one-third and one-half of Europe's population was dead. Cities that had thrived for centuries were emptied. Villages that had stood since Roman times were abandoned entirely, their names surviving only in documents that recorded their disappearance. The medieval world that had seemed eternal, that had organized human life according to patterns believed to be ordained by God, was shattered in ways that would never be fully repaired. We know this story. We have heard the numbers: 25 million dead, perhaps more, perhaps many more, in an age when counting was imprecise and many deaths went unrecorded. We have seen the images, the dance of death in medieval art, the plague doctors in their beaked masks, the mass graves that archaeology continues to uncover. We have learned the history of institutions and powers, of how the plague transformed economies and challenged churches and reshaped the political landscape of Europe. But tonight we enter a different story. Tonight we descend to the level of those who experienced the plague not as historical event, but as lived catastrophe. The peasants who worked the land, who formed the vast majority of medieval population, who had no power to flee to country estates, no wealth to purchase whatever treatments existed, no education to understand what theories physicians proposed. These were the people who faced the plague with nothing but their hands, their faith, their communities, and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived hardships before. How did they survive? Not all of them did, most did not. But some did, and their survival was not merely passive endurance, not merely waiting for death to pass them by. It was active, was strategic, was the application of intelligence and courage to circumstances that seemed to offer no hope. They closed their doors and their villages. They gathered herbs and prepared remedies that could not cure but might comfort. They maintained the rituals of faith when faith seemed to have failed. They cared for their sick and buried their dead, and somehow, through the darkest years in European history, kept the thread of human continuity from breaking entirely. Their story has been largely lost. Peasants did not write chronicles. Their experiences were not recorded, except as statistics in death registers, as gaps in manorial records where names suddenly stopped appearing. What we know of their plague experience comes from fragments, from the observations of literate observers who noticed peasant suffering, from archaeological evidence of abandoned villages and mass graves, from the folk practices that survived into later centuries and can be traced back to plague-time origins. We must piece together their story from these fragments, must imagine what cannot be documented, must honor what cannot be fully known. Tonight we attempt that honoring. We walk through villages as the plague approaches, as it arrives, as it claims its victims, and then finally recedes. We sit with peasants as they make impossible choices, to open doors or keep them closed, to flee or to stay, to maintain hope or to surrender to despair. We witness their faith tested and their communities transformed. We see the old world die and the new world struggle to be born from its ashes. This is not comfortable history. It is not the history of triumph or progress or the inevitable improvement of human conditions. It is the history of catastrophe met with whatever resources were available, of suffering that found no remedy, of death that came for the guilty and innocent alike. But it is also the history of survival, of resilience, of the human capacity to continue when continuation seems impossible. The peasants who lived through the plague years did not know they would survive. They did not know that the dying would end, that spring would return, that the world would rebuild itself around them. They knew only that another day had come and must be faced, that another night must be endured, that the work of living continued even when living seemed barely possible. Let us honor their endurance by attending to their story. Let us learn what they learned, not because plague will return in the same form, though plagues always return in some form, but because the wisdom of survival is always relevant, is always needed, is always being earned by those who face whatever darkness their age presents and find ways through. The fire burns low, the night deepens, and across 7 centuries, the voices of those who survived the Black Death whisper their hard-won knowledge to any who will listen. In the early autumn of 1347, before the dying began, the world moved in rhythms that seemed as eternal as the turning of seasons themselves. The harvest was coming in across Europe, wheat and barley gathered into barns, vegetables stored in root cellars, the annual abundance that would sustain villages through the cold months ahead. Peasants worked their strips of land as their parents had worked them, as their grandparents had worked them, as generations stretching back beyond memory had worked them. The cycle of planting and harvest, of birth and death, of feast days and fast days organized time into patterns that felt not merely customary, but cosmically ordained. This was how the world was. This was how it had always been. This was how it would always be. But something was different in that autumn, though most could not yet name what had changed. Travelers brought stories from distant ports, strange stories, frightening stories, stories that seemed too terrible to be true. Ships had arrived in Sicilian harbors with crews dead or dying, with cargo holds full of goods that no one dared unload. Cities in the east were emptying, their populations fleeing from something that pursued faster than feet could carry. Merchants who dealt in the luxury goods of the Orient spoke of routes disrupted, of trade partners who had stopped responding, of a great silence spreading across the known world from sources no one could identify. The peasants of rural Europe heard these stories distantly, as rumors filtered through the same networks that carried news of wars and royal marriages and church pronouncements. Most paid little attention. The affairs of distant cities had little bearing on the work of bringing in harvest, on the immediate concerns of preparing for winter, on the daily round of labor that consumed their waking hours. Sicily was far away. The Orient was unimaginably distant. Whatever afflicted those places would surely spend itself before reaching villages whose inhabitants had never traveled more than a day's walk from where they were born. But the wise among them, the elderly who had survived previous hardships, the women who tended the sick and knew the signs of illness, the priests who heard confessions and understood how quickly communities could unravel. These felt something in the autumn air that was not merely the approach of winter. They noticed that the stories kept coming, kept getting closer, kept describing horrors that exceeded anything the tellers had witnessed before. They observed that the travelers who brought these stories were themselves increasingly fearful. were themselves beginning to avoid the roads, were themselves seeking shelter rather than continuing their journeys. The signs accumulated through September and October. Trade slowed, then stopped, as merchants refused to travel routes where the sickness was reported. Fairs that should have drawn buyers and sellers from across regions were canceled or attended by only a fraction of their usual crowds. The networks that connected villages to the wider world began to fray, to break, to leave communities increasingly isolated without anyone having decided that isolation was necessary. And then the silence came. Not true silence. There was still the lowing of cattle, the barking of dogs, the sounds of work and weather that had always filled the countryside. But a different silence beneath those sounds, an absence where something should have been present. The pilgrims who usually passed through on their way to shrines stopped appearing. The peddlers who circulated among villages with news and small goods were not seen. The world beyond the village boundary, which had always been present even when not visible, seemed to withdraw, to retreat, to leave each community alone with whatever was coming. Those who sensed this change responded according to their natures. Some sought information, questioning anyone who might know what was happening, piecing together from fragments a picture that grew more frightening the more clearly it emerged. Some sought spiritual protection, increasing their prayers, making offerings at local shrines, seeking to ensure that whatever divine favor might be available would be directed toward their community. Some sought practical preparation, stockpiling food and medicine, reinforcing boundaries that might keep danger out, thinking through scenarios that none of them truly believed would come to pass, but that seemed prudent to consider nonetheless. And some simply continued, as they had always continued, working their fields, tending their animals, maintaining the routines that had structured their lives and their parents' lives and generations of lives before them. Perhaps the news was exaggerated. Perhaps the danger would pass. Perhaps there was nothing to be done anyway. So doing what had always been done was as sensible as any alternative. The harvest would not wait while peasants worried about rumors. The cattle would not feed themselves while their owners contemplated disasters that might never arrive. Life demanded attention, and attending to life was itself a kind of resistance to whatever death might be approaching. The children of that autumn felt something too, though they could not name it. Their parents spoke in lowered voices when they thought the children could not hear. The familiar faces in church seemed worried during prayers. The usual confidence that adults projected, the assurance that the world made sense, that tomorrow would resemble today, that the structures holding everything together were solid and permanent. This confidence seemed to waver, seemed uncertain, seemed to be held in place by effort rather than simply existing as it had always seemed to exist. The last markets of the season were smaller than anyone could remember. The festivals that should have marked the successful harvest were muted, their celebrations tentative, their usual exuberance restrained by a weight that settled over gatherings without anyone acknowledging its presence. The priests, who should have led thanksgiving for abundant crops, found themselves also leading prayers for protection against unspecified dangers, asking for mercy in terms that suggested mercy might be needed, preparing their flocks for possibilities that none wanted to name directly. October gave way to November. The days shortened. The cold came. And in cities to the south, in Sicily, in Italy, in places whose names peasants in northern Europe had perhaps heard but could not have located on any map, the dying had already begun. The shadow that would transform the world was moving northward, following the trade routes that had once carried prosperity, carried now by the very networks of connection that medieval civilization had built to knit its scattered communities together. The peasants of Europe went to their beds on those November nights without knowing that the world they had known was already ending. They pulled their blankets close against the cold and said their prayers and planned for tomorrow's work. They did not know that many of them would not see the spring. They did not know that the villages they had known since birth would be emptied or abandoned. They did not know that the social order they assumed was eternal would be shattered and remade. They knew only that night had come, and sleep was needed, and morning would bring its duties regardless of whatever rumors circulated about distant places. The silence before the shadow, the peace that was not peace, but merely the absence of knowledge. The world holding its breath before breathing became difficult, before the breath itself seemed dangerous, before the simple act of being near another human being became risk that might lead to death. That autumn of 1347 was the last season of the Old World, the last harvest of a civilization that had thought itself stable, the last ordinary days before the extraordinarily terrible years that waited just beyond the horizon, approaching with every sunrise, inevitable and unstoppable, and still, for a few more weeks, unknown. In the geography of catastrophe, there are always anomalies, places where death should have come but somehow did not, communities that should have been emptied but somehow survived, paths that carried plague across continents but somehow failed to reach certain destinations. The Black Death moved through Europe with a comprehensiveness that seemed supernatural, finding every city and most villages, penetrating the remotest valleys and the highest mountain settlements. And yet some places were spared. Some villages watched the plague approach and then, inexplicably, watched it pass them by. Some communities entered the plague years intact and emerged from them still intact, surrounded by depopulated countryside, islands of survival in an ocean of death. The survivors could not explain their fortune. The survivors of neighboring villages could not explain the difference. Modern historians, with all their analytical tools, cannot fully explain why some places escaped while others were devastated. The randomness of survival was itself traumatic. It suggested that there was no logic to who lived and who died, that the universe was not organized according to principles that human minds could understand, that God's mercy or God's wrath fell according to patterns that defied all interpretation. But some patterns can be discerned even if they explain only part of the variation in plague impact. Remoteness mattered. Villages accessible only by difficult paths, settlements high in mountains where winter came early and stayed late, communities that had always been marginal to the networks of trade and travel that connected medieval Europe. These had better odds of escape simply because the plague needed vectors, needed carriers, needed the movement of people and goods that connected places to each other. Where connection was limited, where travelers rarely came, where isolation was simply the condition of existence rather than a response to emergency, the plague sometimes failed to arrive at all. We can walk, in imagination, to such a village, a settlement in the Alps, perhaps, or in the highlands of Scotland, or in the mountains of Spain, places where the approach of any stranger was noticed long before arrival, where the paths that served as lifelines to the outside world also served as early warning systems against whatever that outside world might send. In such a place, autumn of 1347 passed much as previous autumns had passed. The harvest was brought in. The animals were prepared for winter. The community settled into the long months of cold that their location made even longer and colder than the winters of lowland villages. The rumors came later to such places, filtered through the few travelers who ventured into remote regions, often weeks or months out of date by the time they arrived. News of plague in Italy might reach an alpine village by Christmas, when the passes were already closed by snow, when whatever the news described could not possibly reach them until spring, when the isolation that had always been burden now revealed itself as possible blessing. The villagers heard the reports, crossed themselves, said prayers for those who suffered, and continued their lives while watching the paths that led downward toward the infected world. Some remote communities made conscious decisions to seal themselves off. They posted watchers on the approaches to their villages, turned away travelers regardless of their apparent health, refused contact with the outside world entirely until the plague had passed. The decision was not easy. It meant foregoing trade, sacrificing news of relatives in other places, accepting limitation that might itself cause hardship. But the alternative was visible in the stories that continue to arrive. Stories of villages emptied, of families extinguished, of communities that had welcomed travelers and died for their hospitality. The moral weight of such decisions was enormous. To turn away a traveler might be to condemn them to death in the wilderness. To refuse aid to someone fleeing plague-stricken regions might be to deny Christian charity to someone in desperate need. The closed village had to live with the knowledge that its survival came at the cost of denying help to others, that its safety required hardness that contradicted much of what its faith and its traditions demanded. The guilt of the protected accompanied the relief of the protected, and both would be carried forward into years when the immediate danger had passed. The villages that survived through isolation emerged from the plague years into transformed landscape. The markets they had once traded with were gone or reduced to shadows of their former activity. The neighbors they had known in other communities were dead or scattered. The networks that had connected their village to the wider world had been severed by death and would not be easily repaired. They had survived, but they had survived into loneliness, into isolation that had been chosen as defense and now continued as circumstance. And there was the survivor's guilt, the question that no theology could adequately answer, that no priest could resolve, that would haunt protected communities for generations. Why them? Why had their village been spared when the village an hour's walk away had been emptied? What had they done to deserve survival? What had their neighbors done to deserve death? The randomness of it defied the moral framework that medieval people used to understand their world, the framework that assumed God's justice operated according to principles humans could discern. The survival of some and the death of others according to no visible principle was itself a kind of spiritual crisis, a suggestion that the universe was not organized as they had believed. That chance played a larger role than they could accept. Some survivors interpreted their fortune as divine favor, as evidence that their community had found grace when others had not. This interpretation provided comfort, but created problems. It implied that the dead had been less worthy, that the devastated villages had somehow deserved their fate, that God had judged and found wanting those who had perished. Such implications troubled consciences that knew the dead had been ordinary people, no worse than the survivors, no more deserving of death than those who lived. Other survivors interpreted their fortune as random chance, as the luck of geography and timing that had nothing to do with merit or divine intervention. This interpretation was theologically problematic. It reduced God's role in human affairs, suggested a universe operating according to mechanical principles rather than moral ones. But it had the advantage of not requiring that the dead be blamed for their deaths or the survivors credited for their survival. Most survivors probably held both interpretations at once, shifting between them depending on circumstance and emotional need. On good days, they could believe they had been protected, chosen, preserved for purposes that would become clear. On bad days, they faced the possibility that their survival was meaningless, that the deaths of their neighbors were equally meaningless, that the plague had swept through the world according to patterns that had nothing to do with human deserving. The paths that death could not follow led to places that would carry forward both the memory and the burden of survival. The remote villages that escaped the plague became repositories of continuity, places where traditions and knowledge and populations survived that elsewhere had been extinguished. They became, in later generations, sources of repopulation for devastated regions, places from which survivors spread outward to claim lands left empty by death. The isolation that had protected them became, after the plague, a resource that allowed the rebuilding of a shattered world. But first, they had to survive the plague years themselves, not by dying less than others, but by watching and waiting and wondering whether each new season would bring the death that had found so many others. The waiting was its own ordeal. The uncertainty was its own suffering. The spared village lived through years of perpetual alertness, perpetual fear, perpetual preparation for a catastrophe that might still come, that was visiting others even as they remained untouched, that seemed to have selected them for preservation. Through no logic they could understand the paths that death could not follow. The villages that survived, the questions that survival raised, the burden and blessing of continuity in a world where continuity had become rare, had become precious, had become something that would shape all the years that followed. In the corner of a peasant cottage, where the light from the single window created shadows that moved with the sun's passage, herbs hung drying from rafters worn smooth by generations of use. Rosemary and thyme, sage and rue, lavender and wormwood, the plants that peasant women had tended and gathered and preserved for as long as memory extended. This was the pharmacy of the poor, the medicine cabinet of those who could not afford physicians, the accumulated wisdom of grandmothers passed to granddaughters across centuries of trial and error. When the plague came, these herbs became the only weapons available to those who faced death without money or education, the only defense against sickness that no learning could cure. The women who tended these gardens knew things that were not written in medical texts. They knew which plants eased fever and which brought sleep to the suffering. They knew how to prepare poultices that might draw infection from wounds, how to brew teas that might calm the stomach, how to create salves that might soothe skin that burned with fever. They knew these things because their mothers had known them, because the knowledge had been tested and refined across generations, because the plants that did not help had been discarded from the tradition, and the plants that seemed to help had been preserved. None of this knowledge could cure the plague. Nothing could cure the plague. Not the physicians with their expensive treatments, not the priests with their prayers, not the folk remedies that peasant women had used successfully against lesser ailments. The plague killed those who could afford the best care, and those who could afford no care at all, killed those who followed every medical recommendation, and those who followed none, killed with an indifference to human intervention that made all intervention seem futile. The herbs that had helped with ordinary sickness were helpless against the extraordinary sickness that was sweeping the world. But the women gathered them anyway. They gathered them because doing something was better than doing nothing, because the appearance of treatment provided comfort even when the treatment itself could not provide cure, because the dying deserved to be attended to even when attendance could not save them. The herbs became ritual as much as medicine, symbols of care, of effort, of the refusal to abandon the sick to their fate, even when that fate was sealed. The remedies they prepared followed principles that made sense within their understanding of the body and disease. Aromatic herbs were burned to purify the air, which they believed carried the sickness, and which, in fact, did carry the sickness, though not in the form they imagined. Vinegar washes were applied to skin and surfaces, thought to neutralize the corruption that caused illness. Poultices of garlic and onion were placed on the swellings that marked plague infection, their heat and pungency believed to draw out the poison. Strong-smelling substances were held beneath the nose, their intensity thought to overcome the bad air that spread disease. Some of these remedies may have helped, though not for the reasons believed. The aromatic herbs did not purify the air of plague, but their smoke may have repelled the fleas that actually spread the disease. The vinegar may not have neutralized corruption, but its acidity may have had some antiseptic effect on surfaces where bacteria lingered. The strong smells held beneath the nose did nothing to prevent infection, but they may have provided psychological comfort to those overwhelmed by the stench of sickness and death. The help was marginal, was often accidental, was far less than the healers hoped. But it was not nothing, and in a catastrophe where nothing seemed to work, not nothing was the best available. The women who practiced this medicine took enormous risks. To tend the sick was to expose oneself to sickness. To enter houses where plague had struck was to invite the plague into one's own body. Many of those who served as healers died of the illness they tried to heal, their commitment to caring for others becoming the very path by which death reached them. The tradition that made them healers also made them vulnerable, their skill becoming their danger, their knowledge leading them into proximity with death that the ignorant could more easily avoid. And yet they continued. The women who had always cared for the sick continued caring for the sick even when caring had become deadly. The knowledge that had been passed down continued to be applied even when application seemed futile. The gardens continued to be tended. The herbs continued to be gathered. The remedies continued to be prepared. If the plague could not be stopped, at least the sick would not die alone. If the dying could not be saved, at least they would be attended. The ministry of care continued even when the possibility of cure had been abandoned. The children who survived the plague years carried memories of their mothers and grandmothers preparing these remedies, of the smell of burning herbs filling cottages where fever raged, of hands that continued working even as the workers themselves grew sick. These memories shaped the folk medicine that would continue after the plague, that would be passed to future generations, that would survive into centuries when the plague itself was distant memory. The remedies changed, were refined, incorporated new observations from new outbreaks, but the basic tradition, the garden pharmacy, the woman healer, the knowledge passed through practice rather than text. This tradition survived because those who carried it survived, because the chain of transmission was bent but not broken by the catastrophe. The Church viewed this folk medicine with ambiguity. On one hand, the remedies were permitted, even encouraged, as part of the duty to care for the sick. On the other hand, the knowledge that wise women possessed, knowledge of plants, of bodies, of the hidden properties of natural things, this knowledge could easily shade into suspicion of witchcraft, into accusations that the healer's power came from sources other than legitimate tradition. In normal times, this tension was managed through careful boundaries, through the healer's performance of piety, through the community's acceptance of practices that had always been practiced. But plague times were not normal times. Fear and grief and the desperate search for explanation could turn against anyone who seemed to possess unusual knowledge, could transform the healer into scapegoat, could make the very practices that had helped into evidence of malevolent power. Some healers were accused, some healers were punished. The persecution was worse in some regions than others, more intense at some moments than others, but the shadow of accusation fell across the tradition of folk healing, creating risks beyond the already enormous risk of exposure to the sick. To heal was to invite suspicion. To fail to heal, as everyone failed in the face of plague, was to invite accusation. The healers who continued their work did so knowing that they might be blamed for deaths they could not prevent, that their effort might be rewarded with punishment rather than gratitude. After the plague receded, the gardens continued to grow. The herbs still hung drying in cottage corners. The women still gathered and prepared, still passed their knowledge to daughters and granddaughters, still served as the first and often only medical resource available to peasant communities. The plague had proven the limits of their medicine, had shown that some things could not be cured with any remedy then available. But it had also proven the value of their commitment, had demonstrated that care matters even when cure is impossible, had shown that the presence of someone who tries to help changes the experience of suffering even when it cannot change the outcome. The herbs that grew in shadow, the women who tended them, the remedies that could not cure but offered anyway the gift of attention. This was the medicine of the plague years, for those too poor for physicians, too remote for whatever hospitals existed, too numerous for the limited resources that medical care could provide. It was imperfect, was insufficient, was often wrong in its understanding while being right in its intention. It kept some small flame of healing tradition burning through the darkest years, preserved knowledge that would be built upon in better times, maintained the fundamental human commitment to not abandoning the sick even when sickness could not be defeated. The church bell tolled for the dead, and it tolled and tolled and tolled until the sound became continuous, until the pauses between deaths were shorter than the time it took for the bell's echo to fade, until the ringer himself collapsed and the bell fell silent, not because the dying had stopped, but because there was no one left to ring. The faith that had organized medieval life, that had explained the world and humanity's place within it, that had provided comfort in all previous crises, now faced a test that seemed designed to break it entirely. If God was good, how could he permit such suffering? If God was just, what had humanity done to deserve such punishment? If God was present, why did the prayers rising from countless churches seem to meet only silence? The peasants who knelt in those churches, who prayed those prayers, who clung to faith as the world collapsed around them, did not have the luxury of theological speculation. They had only the faith they had been taught, the rituals they had practiced since childhood, the trust that God would somehow make sense of what seemed senseless. They prayed because they had always prayed, because prayer was the only response available when all other responses had failed, because to stop praying would be to surrender to a despair that was itself a kind of death. The priests who led those prayers were themselves struggling. They were dying at rates as high as their parishioners, higher, in some regions, because their duties required them to attend the sick, to administer last rites, to enter homes where death had already claimed some and was reaching for others. The plague killed priests so quickly that many parishes were left without spiritual leadership at the moment when spiritual leadership was most desperately needed. The dying died without the rites that medieval faith believed essential for salvation. The living faced death without the pastoral care that might have helped them face it with dignity. Some priests fled. We must not judge them too harshly. They were human, they were afraid, and the death they faced was terrible beyond anything their training had prepared them for. But their flight left communities abandoned, left the faithful without shepherds, left ordinary people to find their own way through the spiritual crisis that the plague had created. The flight of the priests shook faith, not because priests were expected to be superhuman, but because their flight revealed that no one was superhuman, that the structures that had seemed eternal were maintained by ordinary humans who could break like anyone else. Some priests stayed. They stayed and served and died, administering sacraments until they could no longer lift their arms, hearing confessions until they could no longer hear, praying with the dying until they joined the dying. These priests became martyrs in the eyes of communities that survived, their sacrifice remembered and honored for generations, their example cited when later crises required similar courage. The church that emerged from the plague was shaped by both the priests who fled and the priests who stayed, shaped by the failure that shook faith and by the faithfulness that renewed it. The theology that peasants had been taught struggled to accommodate the plague. Medieval Christianity operated within a moral framework that understood suffering as punishment for sin, that believed God intervened actively in human affairs, that assumed a correspondence between righteousness and prosperity. The plague seemed to contradict all of this. The righteous died alongside the sinful. The pious perished while the impious survived. The prayers that should have brought protection brought nothing visible, nothing measurable, nothing that could be distinguished from the fate of those who did not pray. Some responded by intensifying their faith, by assuming that the apparent failure of righteousness to protect indicated only that humanity was far more sinful than it had realized, that the plague was purifying fire that would burn away corruption and leave only the truly holy. The flagellant movements expressed this response most dramatically. Groups of men and women who wandered from town to town, whipping themselves bloody, believing that self-inflicted suffering might appease divine anger, that public penance might win mercy for communities that private prayer had failed to protect. The flagellants were controversial, were eventually suppressed by church authorities, but they represented a genuine attempt to understand the plague within existing theological frameworks. Others responded by looking for human scapegoats, by finding explanation for divine anger in the presence of those who offended God. Jews became targets across Europe, accused of poisoning wells, of spreading plague deliberately, of being the source of contamination that God was punishing Christians for tolerating. The massacres that followed these accusations were themselves catastrophes layered upon the catastrophe of the plague, violence that revealed how easily fear could become hate, how readily faith could become excuse for murder. The church officially condemned the accusations and the violence, but local clergy often participated in or failed to prevent the persecution. The faith that survived the plague was changed by its passage. The confident theology that had explained a well-ordered cosmos gave way to a more humble recognition that God's ways were mysterious, that suffering could not always be explained, that faith meant trust in what could not be understood rather than certainty about what could be known. The elaborate philosophical systems of high medieval theology continued to be studied, but alongside them grew a more personal, more emotional piety that sought direct experience of the divine rather than intellectual comprehension of divine order. The peasants who lived through the plague years emerged with faith tempered by fire. They had seen their priests die or flee, had seen their prayers go apparently unanswered, had seen the righteous and the sinful fall together, with no visible distinction. They continued to believe, continued to gather in churches, continued to observe feast days and fast days, continued to pray and receive sacraments and hope for salvation. But their belief was different now, was colored by what they had witnessed, was marked by questions that would never be fully answered. The cult of death became more prominent in the decades after the plague. Art depicted the dance of death, the equality of all before mortality, the skull beneath the skin that everyone wore regardless of status. The memento mori, remember that you will die, became not merely pious observation but lived experience, something that survivors knew in their bodies because they had seen so many bodies become nothing but memory. Faith after the plague was faith aware of its own fragility, was hope that had survived hopelessness, was trust that had been broken and rebuilt into something both stronger and more humble. The bells eventually rang again with normal rhythm. For feast days and weddings and ordinary deaths that came one at a time, that left pauses between their tolling, that could be absorbed into the continuing life of communities that had somehow survived. The churches were repaired, were restaffed, were filled again with faithful who came because faith had held when all else failed, because even broken faith was better than no faith, because the alternative to believing was an emptiness that no one could bear for long. The faith that held, the faith that broke, the faith that was rebuilt from fragments into something new. The peasants who prayed through the plague years did not receive the answers they sought, did not see the miracles they hoped for, did not find the explanation that would make suffering make sense. But they found community in shared prayer, found dignity in maintained ritual, found meaning in the very act of continuing to believe when belief seemed impossible. And perhaps that was the miracle. Not that faith moved mountains or stopped plagues, but that faith persisted, that hope survived, that human beings continued to lift their eyes toward heaven even when heaven seemed to have turned away. The knocking came at midnight. Someone outside, a voice, perhaps familiar, perhaps not, calling out a name, asking for entry, seeking shelter from the dark, and whatever pursued through it. Inside the cottage, the family held silent, the father's hand pressed against the wooden bar that held the door shut. The mother gathered the children close. No one answered. No one moved. The knocking continued, then stopped. Footsteps receded into the night, and the family remained, breathing shallow, hearts pounding, knowing they had refused what their faith demanded they give, what their humanity demanded they offer, what survival demanded they withhold. This was the calculus of plague survival, the terrible mathematics that required weighing one life against others, the impossible choices that turned neighbors into threats and mercy into danger. Every person outside your door might be carrying death. Every act of hospitality might be invitation to catastrophe. The Christian charity that had been taught since infancy, the communal bonds that had made village life possible, the simple human obligation to help those in need, all of these conflicted with the single imperative of survival that the plague had made paramount. Villages made collective decisions to close themselves entirely. They designated watchers on approaches, turned away travelers regardless of condition, refused entry to anyone from outside regardless of their claims or their connections. The decision was usually made by consensus among surviving adults, was implemented with whatever force was available, was maintained until the plague had passed, or until the village itself had been broken from within. The isolation was imperfect. Diseases can find paths that humans cannot watch, can arrive through means that vigilance cannot prevent. But imperfect isolation was better than no isolation, and many villages that closed themselves survived, while their more open neighbors were devastated. Families within villages sometimes made similar decisions. They sealed themselves within their homes, refused contact with neighbors who might be infected, emerged only for necessities, and then with precautions that the modern world would recognize, avoiding proximity, avoiding touch, treating every other human as potential source of death. The barriers that developed were social as well as physical. Trust broke down when trust could lead to infection. Community fractured when community meant exposure. The web of relationships that had sustained peasant life for generations was torn apart by the plague's demand that each household protect itself against every other. Those who were turned away understood, often, why they were being refused. They were themselves fleeing, themselves seeking to escape death by leaving places where it had already arrived. They knew the logic that closed doors against them because they would have applied the same logic had their positions been reversed. Understanding did not remove the sting of rejection, did not ease the terror of being alone in a world where help was not available, did not provide the shelter they sought or the care they needed. Some found other places that would accept them. Some died on the roads between villages that refused them. Some carried the plague to communities that were more welcoming and left death as repayment for hospitality. The guilt of the survivors who had closed their doors was permanent. It was not guilt that could be confessed and absolved, not guilt that prayers could release, not guilt that faded with time. It was the guilt of having done what was necessary for survival, of having chosen self and family over stranger and community, of having violated principles that they still believed in even as they violated them. Decades later, survivors would wake from dreams of that knocking, would hear in memory the voices they had not answered, would carry the weight of choices that could not be unmade. Some chose differently. Some opened their doors, accepted travelers, maintained the hospitality that their faith demanded regardless of the risk it created. Some of these died, their generosity repaid with the death it had risked. Others survived, their hospitality somehow failing to bring the plague they had feared. The variation could not be predicted, could not be controlled, could only be observed after the fact, and attributed to whatever explanations survivors preferred. Divine protection, random chance, something in the constitution of particular individuals that made them resistant to infection. The communities that survived the plague years carried these memories into their future. They knew who had closed doors and who had opened them, who had turned away kin and who had accepted strangers, who had survived through hardness and who had survived despite generosity. The memories shaped relationships for generations, created divisions that would not fully heal, established hierarchies of moral status that had nothing to do with the hierarchies of wealth and birth that normally organized medieval society. The good and the bad of plague response were remembered, were discussed, were judged by those who came after, according to standards that those who came after had never been forced to apply to their own choices. Children who had experienced the closing of doors grew into adults who understood that community had limits, that the bonds connecting people could break under sufficient pressure, that the village solidarity they were taught to value had failed the ultimate test. These children became parents who taught their own children different lessons, lessons that incorporated the plague experience, that prepared for future crises, that acknowledged the terrible truths that the plague had revealed about what humans would do when survival demanded it. The doors that remained closed, the knocking that was not answered, the choice that could not be avoided and could not be made without cost. The plague forced upon medieval peasants a moral clarity that peacetime allows us to avoid, the clarity that comes when resources are insufficient, when not everyone can be saved, when the help we offer might destroy those we are trying to protect. They did not choose these choices. They did not want these choices, but they made them, and they lived with them, and they passed the knowledge of what such choices cost to generations that would face their own impossible decisions in crises not yet come. Spring arrived regardless. The earth warmed according to its ancient schedule, unaware of the catastrophe that had transformed the humans who had always tended it. Seeds that had been planted before the dying began, now pushed upward through soil that no one had prepared for their coming, that no one would weed or water or protect. The crops grew wild, tangled, untended, wheat mixed with weeds, vegetables lost among the plants that would have been removed had there been hands to remove them. The agricultural calendar that had organized peasant life for millennia continued without the peasants who had followed it. The rhythm of growth, indifferent to the silence in the villages that had always answered it. The fields told stories of abandonment. In some places, crops grew where they had been planted, were eventually harvested by survivors who claimed what no one else remained to claim, who gathered food that would sustain them through winter and beyond. In other places, crops rotted in fields because there was no one to harvest them, their nutrition lost because the labor that should have gathered it had been lost to plague. In still other places, Fields that had been cultivated for centuries returned to wild growth within a single season. The careful work of generations erased by a single year of neglect. The boundary between human space and wild space dissolving as humans became too few to maintain it. Livestock wandered without supervision. Cattle that had been carefully tended now roamed through abandoned villages, through fields where they trampled whatever grew, through a landscape that no longer contained the humans who had organized their existence. Some animals died of neglect, dependent on humans for feeding through winter, for shelter, for the care that domestication had made necessary. Others survived, going feral, forming wild herds that would be reclaimed by survivors or would disappear into the expanding wilderness that the plague had created. The survivors who emerged from plague winter faced an impossible task. The labor that had been barely sufficient before the plague, that had required the efforts of entire communities working in coordination, now had to be performed by a fraction of the previous workforce. Fields that had taken scores of hands to plant and harvest now had to be worked by a handful of survivors. The choice was stark. Abandon some fields to focus effort on others, or attempt to maintain everything and fail at all of it. Many chose abandonment. Marginal lands that had been brought under cultivation during the centuries of population growth before the plague were now returned to forest and scrub. Villages whose populations had been too reduced to sustain themselves were left empty, their buildings gradually collapsing, their fields gradually rewilding, their existence remembered only in documents that recorded their disappearance. The medieval landscape contracted, pulled back from the edges that population pressure had pushed it toward, concentrated human effort on the best land while releasing the rest. But this contraction created opportunity for those who survived. Land that had been scarce and expensive before the plague was now abundant and cheap. Lords who had commanded many laborers now had to compete for the few that remained. The economics of agriculture inverted, where before there had been too many workers for too little land. Now there was too much land for too few workers. The survivors found themselves in a seller's market for the first time in generations. Their labor suddenly valuable in ways it had never been valuable before. Wages rose. They rose because they had to rise, because lords who offered the old rates found no one willing to work for them, because competition for scarce labor drove prices upward regardless of what authorities decreed. The statute of laborers in England, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, was widely evaded, widely resented, widely recognized as a tempt by the powerful to deny the new reality that the plague had created. Peasants moved, left the lords they had been bound to, sought better terms elsewhere, used the new geography of sparse population to bargain for conditions their parents could never have imagined. The transformation was slow and uneven. Some regions experienced it more dramatically than others. Some lords adapted quickly, offering better terms to retain workers. Others resisted, tried to maintain the old order through force, found themselves in escalating conflict with peasants who had learned that the old order no longer held. The seeds of the peasant revolts that would shake Europe in the decades after the plague were planted in these first post-plague years, when the contradiction between old structures and new realities became impossible to ignore. The children born in this transformed landscape knew nothing else. They grew up working fields that their grandparents would have thought unreachable, Earning wages their grandparents would have thought impossible. Expecting freedoms their grandparents would have thought unimaginable. The world they inherited was not the world that the plague had destroyed. It was a new world, shaped by catastrophe, offering possibilities that only catastrophe could have created. The deaths of so many had become, for those who survived, the opening of doors that had been shut for centuries. The fields that grew without hands, the landscape transformed by absence, the economics of scarcity that elevated those who remained. The plague, which had been nothing but destruction while it lasted, became also the source of changes that would benefit those it had not killed. The guilt of this benefit, profiting from the deaths of neighbors and kin, was another weight that survivors carried, another complexity in the burden of having lived through what so many had not survived. She was 6 years old when the plague came to her village, old enough to understand that something terrible was happening, too young to understand what death meant, what it would mean for her mother to stop moving and be taken away, what it would mean to wake in a house suddenly empty of everyone she had known. The memories would stay with her for the 80 years that remained of her life, fragments of images, sounds, smells that would return unbidden in dreams and in quiet moments, the permanent residue of a childhood interrupted by catastrophe. The plague created orphans by the thousands, children whose parents died, whose siblings died, whose entire families were erased in days or weeks, leaving them alone in a world that had contained them within networks of care that suddenly no longer existed. Some were young enough that they would have no memories of before, would know the plague only through stories, would grow up in the transformed world without direct experience of the world that had been transformed. Others were old enough that they would remember everything, would carry the images of dying and death throughout lives that would be shaped entirely by what they had witnessed. The survival of these children depended on the survival of someone willing to take them in. Extended family, if any survived. Neighbors, if any had resources to share. The church, through its institutions for care of the poor and orphaned, though those institutions were themselves devastated by the plague, their personnel dead, their resources depleted. Strangers who found children wandering and chose to accept responsibility for them. The network of care was fragile, was improvised, was inadequate to the scale of the need. Many children died not of plague, but of the abandonment that plague had created, perishing from hunger or exposure, because there was no one left to care for them. Those who survived did so through luck and through the kindness of whoever found them, a grandmother who had somehow survived, an aunt or uncle in another village, a neighbor who took them in because leaving children to die was something they could not do regardless of the burden it created. The relationships that saved these children were often improvised, were often strained, were often complicated by grief and scarcity, and the difficulty of absorbing new dependents into households already struggling to survive. But they were relationships, were connections, were the basic human commitment to not letting the young perish that transcended the calculations of self-interest that the plague had otherwise made dominant. The psychological impact on surviving children defies easy description. They had witnessed things that children should not witness: the transformation of familiar faces by fever, the convulsions of the dying, the handling of bodies that had been parents or siblings or playmates. They had experienced abandonment even when they were not technically abandoned. The withdrawal of attention as caregivers became sick, the absence of comfort when comfort was most needed, the silence in houses that had been full of voices. They had learned that the world was not safe, that love could be taken without warning, that the adults who were supposed to protect them could not protect themselves. Some of these children developed remarkable resilience. They grew into adults who rebuilt families, who raised children of their own, who created stability out of the chaos they had inherited. The capacity of human beings to recover from trauma, to construct meaningful lives despite devastating beginnings, was demonstrated in countless individual stories of plague orphans who somehow found their way to adulthood and beyond. The resilience did not erase the trauma. The memories remained, the losses remained, the fundamental sense of the world as unsafe remained. But resilience allowed functioning, allowed contribution, allowed the continuation of human community, despite everything that had threatened to end it. Other children were broken by what they had experienced. They grew into troubled adults, unable to form stable relationships, unable to trust, unable to escape the memories that haunted them. The plague created not only immediate death, but also lasting psychological damage that would affect survivors throughout their lives and would be passed in some form to their descendants. The trauma of the plague years was not contained within those years. It echoed forward through generations, shaping families and communities long after the dying itself had stopped. The memories that children carried became, in later years, the source of what communities knew about the plague. The adults who had lived through it were often unable to speak of it, their memories too painful, their survival too complicated for easy narration. But the children who had witnessed could sometimes tell what they had seen, could provide the testimony that became the basis for later understanding. The voices of plagued children, speaking decades later as elderly survivors, became the primary sources for historians attempting to understand what the plague had been like at the level of lived experience. These memories were not always accurate. Childhood memories are shaped by subsequent experience, by the stories that others tell, by the meaning-making that turns raw experience into narrative. What the elderly survivors remembered was not pure recollection, but constructed memory, shaped by everything that had happened since the plague years and by everything they had been told about those years. The memories were valuable nonetheless, not as perfect records of fact, but as records of experience, as testimony to what it had felt like to be a child in a world where the adults were dying and no one could explain why or promise that the dying would end. The children who remembered, the orphans who survived, the trauma that was carried, and the resilience that emerged. The plague years shaped a generation in ways that would influence everything they did, everything they built, everything they taught their own children. The weight of those memories, heavy, permanent, unavoidable, was part of what survivors passed to their descendants, part of the inheritance that the plague left to the centuries that followed. In the great hall of a manor house, the Lord sat alone at a table that had once been surrounded by the large household appropriate to his station. His steward was dead. His chaplain was dead. His reeve and bailiff were dead. The servants who had attended his needs, the tenants who had worked his lands, the community of dependents that had defined his status, most of them were dead, and those who remained had acquired an unfamiliar look in their eyes, a directness that would have been unthinkable before, a sense that the old bargain between lord and peasant had been broken, and would have to be renegotiated. The feudal system that had organized European society for centuries was built on a foundation of labor surplus. There had always been more peasants than land, more hands than work to occupy them, more mouths than food to fill them. This surplus kept wages low, kept peasants bound to the land where they were born, kept the hierarchy stable because those at the bottom had no alternatives that might tempt them to resist. Lords could make demands because peasants had to accept them. The system was not maintained by chains alone, though chains existed. It was maintained by the absence of options that would have made chains necessary. The plague changed the mathematics. With 1/3 to 1/2 of the population dead, there was suddenly more land than peasants, more work than hands, more demand for labor than supply. The peasants who survived knew this, knew it in their bones, knew it in the desperation with which their lords suddenly regarded them, knew it in the offers that began arriving from other lords who would pay more, treat better, bind less. The bargaining power that had been impossible before was now available, and peasants began, cautiously at first and then with increasing boldness, to use it. They demanded higher wages. They demanded better conditions. They demanded freedoms that their parents would not have dared to request. The freedom to move, the freedom to negotiate, the freedom to sell their labor to the highest bidder rather than being bound to serve whoever owned the land they happened to have been born on. Not all of these demands were granted. Not all attempts at negotiation were successful. But the fact that they were made at all represented a transformation in the relationship between those who owned and those who worked, a shift that would reshape European society over the coming decades and centuries. The authorities resisted. The Statute of Laborers in England, passed in 1351, attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and required laborers to serve the same lords they had served before the plague. Similar measures were enacted across Europe as ruling classes tried to maintain their position against the market forces that the plague had unleashed. The laws were enforced, sometimes brutally. Peasants who demanded higher wages or moved without permission faced fines, imprisonment, physical punishment. The attempt to preserve the old order through legal force was intense and prolonged. But laws cannot repeal economics. The shortage of labor was real, and no statute could create workers where plague had destroyed them. Lords who insisted on the old terms found themselves without workers entirely. Lords who offered better terms quietly attracted the workers they needed. A black market in labor developed, where the legal rates were ignored and actual rates were determined by supply and demand. The statutes created resentment without achieving compliance, created the sense among peasants that the system was rigged against them, created the fuel that would eventually ignite in open revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was the most dramatic expression of this transformation, though similar movements occurred across Europe. The immediate trigger was a poll tax, but the underlying cause was decades of frustrated expectation, of legally suppressed demands, of knowledge that the old order had been broken by the plague, but that the powerful were refusing to acknowledge what everyone could see. The rebels demanded the abolition of serfdom, demanded fair wages, demanded treatment as free people rather than as property attached to land. The revolt was suppressed, its leaders executed, its immediate demands denied. But the direction of change was clear. The old order could be defended but not restored. Each generation after the plague would move further from the bondage that had preceded it. For the peasants who lived through this transition, the change was experienced as both liberation and disruption. The old system had been oppressive, but it had also been predictable. Everyone knew their place, knew their obligations, knew what they could expect. The new system offered possibilities, but also uncertainties. Wages might be higher, but they also had to be negotiated. Movement might be possible, but it also meant leaving the community where one's family had lived for generations. The freedom that the plague had created was real, but it was also destabilizing, requiring peasants to navigate a world that no longer told them exactly where they belonged. The new order rising, the transformation of labor from bondage to something approaching bargaining, the resistance of the powerful and the persistence of the powerless, the plague, which had seemed purely destructive while it lasted, became also the agent of changes that those at the bottom of society had never dared to hope for. The medieval world that emerged from the plague years was different from the world that had entered them. Not better in all ways, not progressing toward any inevitable improvement, but different, changed, opened by catastrophe to possibilities that normal life had not permitted. The burial pit was full. They had started it 2 weeks ago when the churchyard could hold no more, when the graves that had been dug one by one for individuals who were prayed over by name could not keep pace with the dying. Now the pit held scores of bodies, perhaps hundreds, layered, covered with quickite, covered with earth, covered with more bodies when the dying continued, covered again. No names were recorded for many of those who lay within. No individual prayers were said. The rites that medieval Christianity believed essential for the soul's journey were abandoned because there was no time, no personnel, no capacity to maintain the rituals that the faith demanded. Medieval people believed that the dead required the prayers of the living. The doctrine of purgatory taught that souls spent time after death being purified of sin, and that this time could be shortened by the prayers of those who remembered them, by masses said in their behalf, by the commemoration that kept their memory alive. Among the living, the dead were not gone, not entirely. They existed in relationship with the living, in a community that spanned the boundary of death, maintained through prayer and memory and the rituals that connected the two realms. The plague broke this connection. There were too many dead, dying too fast, for the individual attention that each soul was believed to deserve. The mass graves that the plague required were violations of the proper order of death, disruptions of the relationship between living and dead, sources of spiritual distress that added to the physical and emotional devastation of the dying time. Those who buried the dead in pits knew they were failing the dead, knew they were consigning souls to uncertain fates, knew they were doing what had to be done, while knowing that what had to be done was wrong. The families of those buried without proper rites carried this knowledge as additional grief. They had not only lost their loved ones, they had failed to give them the death they deserved, the death that might have ensured their soul's welfare. The guilt of this failure compounded the grief of the loss, created a burden that could not be laid down through confession or penance, that remained as permanent mark of the plague years. In later decades, masses would be said for the souls of plague victims. Prayers would be offered for those who had died without proper rites. Attempts would be made to repair what the plague had damaged. But the repair was incomplete. could never fully make up for what the emergency had forced the living to neglect. The locations of the mass graves became sacred sites of a particular kind, places of horror and holiness intermingled, places where the physical remains of the dead demanded acknowledgement even when individual acknowledgement was impossible. Some of these sites were marked in later years with monuments, with chapels, with the memorials that communities created when they could think clearly about what had happened. Others were forgotten, their locations lost as the generations passed, their existence known only through documents that recorded that such burials had occurred somewhere in this parish, somewhere in these fields. The archaeological recovery of plague pits in modern times has revealed what the medieval documents recorded. Bodies laid in rows or piled without order, bones of all ages and conditions mixed together, the physical evidence of haste and crisis that no written account could fully convey. The excavations are always conducted with care, with awareness that these are not merely specimens, but are human remains, the last physical traces of people who lived and suffered and died in circumstances that remain moving even across the centuries. The names are still unknown, will always remain unknown, but the bodies are treated with the respect that the plague years could not provide. For the communities that survived, the mass graves became part of the landscape, part of the inheritance, part of what had to be lived with and lived around. Everyone knew where the pits were, knew that beneath the surface lay the bodies of neighbors and kin, knew that walking across certain fields was walking across the dead. The knowledge shaped behavior, shaped where people built, shaped where people cultivated, shaped the mental geography of communities that had buried their own in haste and had to live forever in proximity to those burials. The prayers continued. They continued because the need for them continued, because the souls buried without proper rites still needed what they had not received, because the living owed the dead whatever could still be given even when it was not enough. The churches that had stood empty during the worst of the plague filled again when the crisis passed, filled with survivors who prayed for those they had lost, who lit candles for souls whose names they remembered and for souls whose names had been forgotten, who maintained the relationship between living and dead that the plague had strained but not entirely broken. The graves that held no names, the burials without rites, the debt that the living owed the dead and could never fully repay. The plague years created a spiritual crisis alongside the physical and social crises, a disruption of the relationship between the living and the dead that medieval Christianity considered essential to both. The repair of this relationship would take generations, would never be complete, would remain as permanent scar on the religious life of communities that had buried too many too fast without the care that each soul deserved. The first spring that felt truly like spring came perhaps 5 years after the worst of the dying, perhaps longer in some regions, perhaps shorter in others. It was not that death had stopped. The plague would return, would strike again and again for centuries. But the acute phase, the phase when death was overwhelming and constant and inescapable, that phase had passed. The survivors emerged from whatever shelters they had found, looked around at the world the plague had made, and began the work of living in it. The birds returned to villages that had enough people to notice them. The songs that had seemed to mock the dying, that had continued in their mechanical cheerfulness while humans suffered and perished, now sounded different, sounded like affirmation, like evidence that the world contained more than death, like promise that life would continue in forms that transcended human catastrophe. The peasants who heard the birds in that first true spring heard them with ears that had been tuned by loss, heard in them both the indifference of nature and its persistence, heard the message that the seasons would continue, whether humans survived to witness them or not. The gardens were planted again with the care that had been impossible during the worst years. The herbs that had been gathered desperately for remedies that could not cure were now tended for cooking, for medicine against ordinary ailments, for the thousand uses that the growing things served in peasant life. The gardens represented continuity, the same plants that had grown before the plague, grown by the same techniques, serving the same purposes. The world had changed, but some things had not changed, and the gardens were evidence that the foundations of peasant existence remained intact. The markets reopened, though smaller than before, though attended by fewer buyers and sellers, though offering goods in quantities that reflected the reduced population that the plague had left. To attend a market in those first years after the plague was to see the absence as clearly as the presence, the empty stalls where vendors no longer lived, the reduced crowds where there had once been throngs, the general quiet where there had once been noise. But the markets functioned, goods were exchanged, the economic life that had sustained medieval communities resumed in diminished form. Children were born. This was perhaps the most powerful evidence that life would continue. The cries of infants in villages that had held only the cries of the dying. The presence of new life in places that had seemed to contain only death. The children born in those first years after the plague would never know the world that had been destroyed, would grow up in the world that the plague had made, would take for granted conditions that their parents knew to be new and fragile and strange. The generation gap that the plague created was absolute. Those born after could not share the experiences of those who had lived through, could only receive those experiences as stories that they could never fully understand. The churches held baptisms for these children, held weddings for those who were forming new families to replace the families that had been lost. The rituals of beginning returned alongside the rituals of ending that had dominated the plague years. Life proceeded, not as it had before, not without awareness of what had happened, but proceeded nonetheless, moved forward into whatever future the survivors would create. The elderly who had lived through the plague became the keepers of memory, the sources of knowledge about what the world had been like before, and what it had been like during the worst years. They told stories to grandchildren who listened with the half-attention that children give to stories of times they cannot imagine, who absorbed without fully understanding the wisdom that their elders tried to pass down. The memories would become family lore, would become village tradition, would become the foundation of folk knowledge that would persist for generations. How to recognize plague symptoms, how to protect against infection, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. The seasons returned in their ancient rhythm, indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to human recovery, continuing the cycle of growth and decay that had preceded humanity and would outlast it. The peasants who observed these seasons after the plague observed them with changed eyes, with awareness that the rhythms that seemed eternal could contain catastrophe, that the world that seemed stable could be transformed beyond recognition. But they observed them nonetheless, planted when planting was required, harvested when harvest came, followed the calendar that organized agricultural life, because following it was what one did, because the alternative was to stop, to surrender, to acknowledge that the plague had won by refusing to continue. The seasons that returned, the life that resumed, the continuity that survived despite everything. The peasants who lived through the plague and beyond it carried forward both the memory of catastrophe and the commitment to continuation that catastrophe had not extinguished. They planted their gardens and attended their markets, and held their children, and prayed their prayers, and died their eventual ordinary deaths, having survived the extraordinary deaths that had taken so many around them. Their survival was not triumphant, was too marked by loss, too weighted by memory, too complicated by guilt and grief for triumph. But it was survival, was continuation, was the stubborn persistence of human life against everything that had threatened to end it. By the light of a fire that had burned in this hearth for as long as anyone could remember, an old woman prepared herbs as she had prepared them for 60 years. Her hands knew the work without requiring thought, knew which plants to crush and which to leave whole, knew the proportions that had been taught to her by her mother, who had learned them from her mother in a chain of transmission stretching back beyond memory. The granddaughter watched, as she had been brought here to watch, to learn, to receive the knowledge that would make her keeper of this tradition when the old woman was gone. The plague had nearly broken this chain. So many who knew had died before they could teach. So many young who should have learned had died before they could receive. The accumulated wisdom of generations, knowledge that lived only in minds and hands, that had never been written down, that existed only in the doing and the teaching, had been diminished by the dying, reduced by each death to a smaller and smaller pool. What survived did so through the survivors who carried it, through the old women and the wise men who had lived through the plague and still lived to teach what they knew. This wisdom was not academic knowledge, not learning from books, not the kind of understanding that universities preserved. It was practical knowledge, how to prepare food so it would keep, how to treat wounds so they would heal, how to recognize the signs of illness that demanded attention and the signs that would pass on their own. It was environmental knowledge, which plants grew where and when they should be gathered, which animals behaved how and what their behavior predicted, how the sky and wind and birds foretold the weather that would come. It was social knowledge, how to navigate the hierarchies that organized peasant life, how to bargain with lords and traders, how to maintain the relationships that provided security in times of need. The plague had tested this wisdom and found it both valuable and insufficient. The folk remedies could not cure the plague, but they could provide comfort. The social knowledge could not prevent the breakdown of community, but it could guide reconstruction. The practical skills could not stop the dying, but they could help the survivors live. What the peasants knew was not enough to defeat the catastrophe, but it was enough to survive it, and surviving was what the wisdom was ultimately for. The teaching continued through the years after the plague, continued with urgency that the catastrophe had created. Those who knew understood that they might die before their knowledge was fully transmitted, that each death of an elder took wisdom that might never be replaced, that the chain of tradition was fragile and required constant maintenance to persist. They taught more deliberately, more thoroughly, more insistently than their own teachers had taught them, because they understood what could be lost if teaching failed. The students learned with awareness that their elders carried knowledge bought at terrible cost. The old woman who taught herb preparation had nursed the dying, had watched her own children die, had continued gathering and preparing because the work was needed, and she was still alive to do it. Her knowledge was not abstract. It was encoded with the memory of everyone she had tried to help, everyone she had failed to save, everyone whose suffering she had eased, even when she could not end it. To learn from her was to receive not just the techniques, but also the weight they carried, the history that infused every gesture. The wisdom that survived the plague was different from the wisdom that had preceded it. It incorporated new knowledge, how plague spread, how it could be resisted, how communities might protect themselves when it returned. It incorporated new caution, awareness that catastrophe could come without warning, that the world was less stable than previous generations had believed, that preparation for disaster was rational rather than pessimistic. It incorporated new resilience, confidence that survival was possible even when survival seemed impossible, that human beings had faced the worst and had found ways through, that what had been done could be done again if necessary. This wisdom would be tested. The plague returned in 1361, in 1369, in repeated outbreaks through the following centuries, never again with quite the same devastating impact as the first arrival, but always dangerous, always requiring the application of what had been learned. Each outbreak added to the wisdom, refined the knowledge, proved or disproved the techniques that had been developed. The tradition evolved, became more effective, became the accumulated response of generations facing recurring threat. The last students of those who had survived the first plague would teach their own students, who would teach their students, who would carry the tradition forward into centuries when the plague itself became distant memory. The chain of transmission that had nearly broken in 1348 continued, carried the knowledge forward, kept alive the wisdom that peasants had developed in the worst years of their history. The fire burned, the herbs were prepared, the knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. The human commitment to learning from the past and preparing for the future, persisting through everything that had tried to end it. The village stands where it has stood for 700 years. The church that held the dying still holds services, still gathers the descendants of those who survived, still offers the prayers that have been offered in this place since long before the plague arrived. The fields that grew without hands are now tended by machines that no medieval peasant could have imagined, producing abundances that would have seemed like heaven to those who knew hunger as constant companion. The world has changed beyond recognition, but this place has continued, has maintained its thread of human presence through all the changes, has carried forward whatever it means to belong to a place across centuries of transformation. Beneath the surface, the dead remain. The mass graves that the plague required have never been exhumed, will never be fully mapped, exist as invisible presence beneath the visible landscape. Walking across certain field is walking across the dead, though no one now knows exactly where the burials are, though the knowledge of specific locations has been lost while the general knowledge that burials occurred persists. The dead are here, somewhere, their bones mingled with the soil that produces the crops that their descendants eat, their presence forgotten in specificity but remembered in aggregate. The The silence where the plague once walked is not empty silence. It is filled with everything that has happened since, with 7 centuries of human life continuing in a place that almost ended. The silence contains all the births and deaths that followed the catastrophe, all the seasons that returned and kept returning, all the ordinary days that accumulated into years and decades and centuries of persistence. The silence is the sound of survival extended through time, of the decision to continue that survivors made each day being made again by each subsequent generation. What do we owe to those who lived through the plague years? We owe them remembrance, acknowledgement that they existed, that they suffered, that they found ways through suffering that we who have not faced equivalent catastrophe cannot fully understand. We owe them respect, recognition that their knowledge and their courage sustained humanity through crisis, that we exist because they persisted, that the world we inhabit is built on foundations they maintained when maintaining seemed impossible. We owe them attention, willingness to learn what they learned, to consider what they faced, to let their experience inform how we understand our own relationship with catastrophe and survival. The peasants who survived the Black Death were not special people, not heroes by any standard definition, not distinguished from their neighbors who died except by luck and whatever small advantages circumstances provided. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary crisis, doing what ordinary people do when survival demands everything, persisting, adapting, hoping, enduring. Their survival was not triumph over the plague, but continuation through it. Not victory, but persistence. Not conquest, but the simpler and more fundamental achievement of still being there when the dying stopped. Their descendants include everyone alive in Europe today. Everyone descended from those who survived the reduction by 1/3 or 1/2 of the continent's population. We are the children of survivors, inheritors of whatever genetic or cultural advantages survival conferred, beneficiaries of the decisions made by medieval peasants whose names we will never know. The plague is distant from us, is history that seems to belong to another world, but it is connected to us through the unbroken chain of generations that links every living person to ancestors who somehow lived through what seemed unsurvivable. The night deepens over the village that has stood for 7 centuries. The stars that medieval peasants watched are the same stars, though we see them now through air altered by centuries of human activity, through skies brightened by lights they could never have imagined. The silence that settles over the fields is the silence that has settled every night since the plague years, the silence that survivors heard, and their children heard, and all the generations between them and us have heard. The silence that contains everything and reveals nothing. The silence that is the sound of time passing over places where humans have persisted. Rest now with the knowledge that survival is possible, that humans have faced the worst and found ways through, that the catastrophes we fear are real, but so is the resilience that meets them. Rest with awareness that you are descended from survivors, that survival is in your inheritance, that the capacity to endure is written in the genes and cultures that medieval peasants passed down to you across 7 centuries of continuation. The plague is over. The dying has stopped. The spring has returned, and the seasons continue their ancient cycle, and the children are born who will carry forward whatever we leave them. The silence where the plague once walked is full of everything that has followed, full of life that persisted, full of the quiet miracle of continuation that requires neither explanation nor justification, but simply the fact that we are here, that the world is here, that the story continues. Sleep now. Let the silence hold you. And know that you rest on foundations laid by those who survived what you have only read about, built by those whose names are lost, but whose lives are present in everything you inherit, maintained by generations who decided each day to continue, because continuing was what humans do, what humans have always done, what humans will continue to do as long as the story lasts. The plague is over. The silence remains. And in the silence, if you listen, you can hear the breathing of 7 centuries of survival, the quiet rhythm of life continuing, the heartbeat of humanity, that the plague could not stop, and nothing has ever stopped. The persistence that is both our heritage and our gift to those who will come after, who will rest on foundations we maintain, who will owe us the same debt we owe to those who survived the Black Death years and left us everything. Good night.